Cool. Okay. We went from 0 attendees to 130 in like a second. Thanks y'all for joining us on Zoom and on Facebook. I'm going to give it literally just one more minute before we go ahead and get started. Yes, I see a question about recordings. We will have a recording, like it's recording now, and we'll make sure to send that out after this is over. All right, I said 1 minute, so we can go ahead and get started. Welcome y'all to our third webinar in the Cops and Capitalism series, hosted by Action Center on Race and the Economy and Little Sis. My name is Alex Goodwin, and I'm a senior organizer at ACRE, and I'll let Molly introduce herself.
Hey everyone, I'm Molly, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Little Sis. And we also have Derek from Little Sis, one of our amazing researchers who's helping us with all of the tech and back end as well.
So if you are new here, welcome. If this is your first webinar in the series, welcome. Thanks for joining us. ACRE, or Action Center on Race and the Economy, is a research and organizing hub that focuses on the ways that Wall Street is extractive from communities of color. And Little Sis is a research hub that does very dope power mapping work and research on the wealthy and corporate elite. So I highly suggest going to check out Little Sis on Twitter, going to check out their website, because a lot of the stuff that we're going to get into today comes out of their research. So also, like, if you joined us for any of the webinars up until this point, thank you for sticking with us throughout the summer. You could either drop in the chat and let us know which ones that you've been to so far. The idea is that this will seamlessly build on the work that we've been talking about up until now, and also stand alone by itself. So just a few things on logistics. We do encourage y'all to use the chat. Feel free to ask questions of the panelists or each other. Also feel comfortable to ask us as panelists to slow down, repeat, define, or clarify anything. I know I have a habit of getting real jargony. I might talk real fast because my head is always in this stuff. So, I'm very open to slowing down. And then just a couple notes on our agenda. We're planning an hour and a half of your time. First, we'll start talking about what police foundations are and why they're important, especially in this context of campaigns to defund the police. And then we will talk about what a local police foundation campaign could look like. There will be a poll at the end asking if you're interested in campaigning on any of the stuff that we talk about. And so if that's you and we get there, feel free to drop in the chat that this is some work that you might want to take on. And then lastly, we're going to equip y'all with some actual research skills. You will have something to take away from this webinar to help you investigate your local police foundation. And so if that is good with everybody, I'm just going to check the chat real quick for questions, and then we will jump right in. Cool. Are there closed captions available? Unfortunately, that is not something that we have planned for, but we'll definitely make sure that that happens for the next the webinars in the rest of the series. Thank you for lifting that up. And it looks like we've got some folks who have attended some of the webinars in the past. That's awesome. Thanks, y'all, for joining us. So just to get us grounded in what we're going to do today, we have a sort of check-in question for you, and that is, what do you know about your local police foundation? And again, like, we encourage folks to drop things in the chat. What do you know about your local police foundation? It can be that you might not know anything, or it can be like, oh, you know, I've seen those license plates. That's like how I equate police foundations. I always see people driving around with those frames on their license plates that says they are a supporter. Those are not my favorite cars on the road. Okay, yeah, it looks like most folks. Cool, okay. Well, we are all pretty much starting on the same page. And I'm really excited to get into this because by the end of this webinar, you will be moved. Okay, so before we get into the actual police foundation stuff, I want to do a refresher on what we've reviewed so far in our series. In our very first webinar, which some of y'all were able to attend, you'll see this image on the top left of your screen of, this is the cover of ACRE's Police Brutality Bonds report. And we used our first webinar to talk about that research. And so police brutality bonds, as a reminder, or if you're new to this, are when a city borrows to pay for police brutality settlements. This creates an immediate profit for banks who make the deals happen, and then a long-term profit for the investors who are invested in that borrowed chunk of money. And this was one very specific way that we saw the role of banks not only profiting from police violence, but also helping police and cities to avoid accountability and avoid being transparent about how much police violence is costing. And I'm just gonna drop a link in the chat. I see somebody saying that it's hard to read. Yep, that's okay. We don't necessarily want you to read everything on the screen on this slide. This is just so folks can get a feel of what we've talked about so far. And I'll provide links so that you can see this stuff yourself. So then building off that first webinar, in the second webinar, we looked at a breakdown of the City of Philadelphia budget so that we could get an idea of how much the budget was and how much police were draining out of that city budget. And we walked through a process with one of ACRE's researchers, Brittany Austin. Shout out to Britt, who also created a how-to guide, how to look through your own city budgets and find stuff about the police department. Another thing that we did in the last webinar was we looked at the how you can find which corporations in your state and city are also draining from the budget by not by partaking in these large tax breaks. And so the example that we used was Pennsylvania, and we saw that there were corporations getting over $5 billion in subsidies. And these things are, we talked about all of these things, and these things all build on each other because what we are trying to get across in this series is the role that corporations and finance have played in creating the conditions for police violence, over policing, surveillance, and also that when we say we need to defund the police, that we also have to talk about the relationships that corporations and banks have with police departments as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so this visual here is to help us get a little bit more of an idea of what that relationship looks like between corporations and Wall Street and police departments. We know that corporations and banks don't pay their fair share of taxes, and they load us up with debt. That's us individually and our cities. And that means that there's less money to contribute to our city budgets and our public resources. And we've seen throughout the history of the US that local elected officials and state elected officials see that their solution to poverty or a neighborhood with a lack of resources is to just send in more policing. which then creates higher risk of police violence, higher risk of mass incarceration in specific neighborhoods. And, police violence and mass incarceration, that's money coming out of our budget again, in another way. And so, when there is less money in our budget for our public services, corporations and banks then come in to the problem that they have helped to create with the solution of privatization and putting more debt onto us. And this very ugly, chaotic cycle just continues to roll. And another thing that we hope that you take away from this and that we've been talking about in the last few webinars is that police and law enforcement are the muscle of racial capitalism, knowing that they are brought in to protect the interests of the status quo or the wealthy, right? We saw that in Chicago just last week when protesters or people, right, community members, residents of the city who did not want the Christopher Columbus statue present went out to make their voices heard, and a CPD officer punched an 18-year-old girl's teeth out, right? All in the name of protecting property rather than public safety. So, we, with this cycle and with the things that we've been talking about in this webinar, we see and are trying to drive home for y'all that the purpose of police is to protect capital, and that, we have to start addressing relationships to policing outside of the budget. And so with that, I am going to pass to Molly to talk more about how police foundations fit into all of this.
Cool, thanks, Alex. So yeah, at Little Sis for the last couple of years, we've been kind of investigating these private police foundations and the corporations that back them, the corporations that lead them, and kind of the role that they play in maintaining the policing status quo as we know it. So I'm just going to share a little bit about kind of what we've learned. So first of all, really basic, what are police foundations? They're basically private nonprofit organizations that raise money for the police. That's their sole purpose, is to raise even more money for the police, which we know already get hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every year in their public budgets. And they raise that money from corporations and from wealthy individuals. And the first police foundation was started in the 1970s in New York City. But now they've really spread across the country, and big cities to small towns have them. So you can see on this slide, some of the biggest ones are the New York City Police Foundation and the LA Police Foundation, but Charlottesville has a police foundation, Fairfield, New Jersey has a police foundation. So really towns of all places where you find police, you often find these foundations. And they were actually, the first one was started in New York City by the real estate industry at a time when the city was facing major budget cuts, and the then mayor had a plan to privatize part of the police department and wanted to have a completely privately funded armed police department that would protect downtown Manhattan. And so the real estate industry and kind of other members of the corporate class in New York City started this foundation to basically be an open checkbook for that program. And that specific program never came to be, but this idea that it was really useful to have these foundations to both build connections between kind of the corporate class of the city and the police, and also raise additional money, became really popular and spread out across a bunch of different places. And, when we're talking about these police foundations, they really do raise significant amounts of money. They're not as much as police departments are getting from public money, but a lot of the galas that you can see on this picture raise millions and millions of dollars for the police every year. And I'll show you a little bit later how to figure out how much your local police foundation has raised for the police department. But so we're really talking about significant amounts of money. Just one fundraiser in New York City last year for the police foundation raised $5.5 million, for example. And they're getting that money from some of the richest billionaires and corporations in the world. For example, in one of these pictures on the left here, you see the police commissioner of New York with Larry Fink, who is a billionaire who runs BlackRock, the financial asset manager, who's debatably one of the wealthiest, well, is one of the wealthiest and debatably one of the most powerful people in Wall Street and in the world. So we can go to the next slide. And so once these police foundations raise this money, they then basically help local police departments buy technology and fund programs that they couldn't otherwise get, or that it would be kind of annoying for them to have to purchase with public money because there would be additional oversight. So in particular, we've really noticed these foundations help police departments purchase particularly kind of controversial either equipment, things like militarized equipment, SWAT gear, tanks, stuff like that. And then also very controversial surveillance technology that is targeting, Black and brown neighborhoods for surveillance by the police. And we've seen that in a bunch of different places. For example, in Atlanta, the police foundation there bought 12,000 surveillance cameras for the police department to basically like blanket the city with surveillance cameras. In LA, the police department was interested in purchasing surveillance software from Peter Thiel's company, Palantir, but they knew that there would be kind of like a big uproar over it if they did that publicly. So instead, they got the local police foundation to arrange a donation from Target to buy the software, and they didn't have to go through any kind of public oversight. Here in Philly, where I am, the police foundation purchased long guns, drones, and SWAT equipment last year for the police foundation. So they're really helping kind of even more militarized local police departments, give them more resources, more surveillance, more technology, which also comes from corporations, and the ACRE folks talked about in one of the previous webinars. We can go to the next slide. The kind of, this is like a particularly egregious example of something police foundations can also do, which is in Atlanta recently, in the wake of the police murdering a Black man there. They just gave every cop a $500 bonus because police were quitting and because of the public pressure they were facing. And so the police foundation just gave them all $500 to try to keep them on the force and keep them on the streets. We can go to the next slide. The other kind of really important piece of this that police foundations also fund is kind of false solutions to police violence, and a lot of the reforms that we know don't work, which is why we're calling for, complete defunding of the police. Things like anti-bias training, community policing programs, fun runs between police and kids, trips to the African American History Museum and the Holocaust Museum in DC, all of these things that we've seen again and again and again don't work to end police violence. I think particularly we saw like in Minneapolis, that police department had instituted many reforms, but it didn't stop them from murdering George Floyd. So that's another really kind of important way that these police foundations kind of prop up the current system of policing is by like legitimizing these programs and saying, well, we can fix the police by giving them more resources when we know that's completely backwards logic. So once we understand kind of that's the role of police foundations, to raise money, to purchase controversial equipment, and to kind of prop up the falsehood that more resources equal better police, the question obviously becomes who is funding these police foundations and who's leading them. And we can go to the next slide. And really from looking at police foundations all over the country, it becomes really clear, like if you want to know who is running your city, just like shortcut, look at the police foundation, look at the board, and it'll give you a really good sense of who the elites are and who is making decisions. And typically on any single police foundation board, you're gonna see these different categories of people represented. So the police union president is always gonna be on there, the local police commissioner. There'll be a handful of executives from local big powerful corporations, big employers in the region, real estate developers, which, you know, again, goes back to the original founding of these foundations by the real estate industry and the role of police to protect not only capital, but also real estate and buildings. There usually will be some representatives of your local banks, either, you know, local smaller banks or big multinationals like, you know, Wells Fargo, US Bank. Local universities often will be represented. Social clubs, like essentially country clubs for rich people, there'll be representatives from there. And then also some companies whose maybe their names aren't as familiar to you, but contract specifically with the police. So things like Motorola Solutions, Dintech, that make a lot of their money through contracts with local police departments will also be represented on there. And then also some lawyers and kind of PR professionals. You know, oftentimes the law firm that represents your local police union will be on there, or other just kind of big law firms that do a bunch of work for corporations as well. So let's go to the next slide. So this is just a specific example to show kind of particular names of those categories from in Philly, where I'm from. These are all board members of our local police foundation. So, you know, you have the head of the Fraternal Order of Police. You have the head of the Union League, which is like the big social club next to the Ritz-Carlton here in Philly that hosts fundraisers for the police foundation. And that's really like a key social space for the rich people of Philly. Temple and Penn, two big universities here, have representatives. Comcast, which is kind of our signature big Fortune 500 company. And then you have banks, real estate, and law firms. And I think if you just try to like think for a minute in your head, like what would a board of trustees meeting look like with all of these people in one room together, you start to really get a sense of like why these police foundations are so important and so problematic and are really standing in the way of any kind of defunding of the police. Just start to think about like the kinds of conversations these people might have, the priorities they have, the types of programs that they want to fund. And you can see this is like a really integral space for connecting kind of local corporate power brokers with police and providing a space where they can communicate and coordinate and make priorities. So we can go to the next slide. And, you know, when we say that there are major corporate backers to these police foundations, you know, it's not just, oh, like your small local business that will like host a barbecue for the police. It's really big Fortune 500 companies, names that are recognizable to you across all different kinds of industries, including Wall Street, including retail and food, including big tech, fossil fuels, and then also higher education and universities. And you can see here a map that I believe Derek and Jin, that shows some of the major backers of these police foundations. I'll share a link too in case people need to see it more up close, but it's a lot of really familiar names: Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Target, CocaCola, Microsoft, Amazon. And I think the other kind of important thing that I'm sure is in everyone's minds, but like is important to just kind of name, is that a lot of these corporations are giving money to police foundations, on the boards of these police foundations, while at the same time putting out statements saying like, we support Black Lives Matter, racism is a problem. Like Jamie Dimon from Bank of America is like taking a knee at a Bank of America branch. And it just really highlights the hypocrisy and that they're saying one thing and doing another really clearly with their money. We can go to the next slide. So here's just a more kind of zoomed in look at some of the corporations that back police foundations. And I'm gonna go into this more in the research section, but their involvement will differ and you'll kind of have to do some research on your local police foundation to see how they're involved. Some are donors or corporate partners. Sometimes they have executives on the board of the foundation. Sometimes they sponsor those big fundraising galas. And it really just is different place to place. You know, for example, in Atlanta, CocaCola, which is obviously a huge corporate presence there, gave $2 million to the police foundation in 2018. And one of their top ranking executives sits on the board. Some corporations like Wells Fargo and Target in particular are giving to many different police foundations in many different cities, have people on the boards in many different cities. And we'll talk more about that as well. So yeah, these are just some examples of particular corporations. And I'm gonna throw it back. Well, first, are there any questions from the chat that people have about any of this?
Molly, I answered most of the questions in the Q&A,
Okay, cool.
but there was a question from Terrence Frazier. This was like maybe 10 minutes ago, asking which mayor were you referring to and what was the year for the first New York Police Foundation?
Mayor Lindsay was the mayor who had the privatize the police plan. And I'm not sure exactly the year, it was sometime in the 70s, but when we share out the materials from this, I can also share a couple of links to that history if people are interested, because I think it's pretty interesting and kind of instructive for the time that we're in.
And then 2 more questions in the chat. Who picks people to be on foundations, and is there coordination between state, county, and city level foundations?
Yeah, those are both good questions. In terms of picking who is on the police foundation boards, I think it's just the current board members kind of recruit from their circles, which is similar to a lot of nonprofits. I'm not sure if they have my sense from Philadelphia is, you know, they always want someone from Penn. They always want someone from Comcast. Like there's a couple of major players that it's like there's always going to be someone there. And then for the PR people, the lawyers, the social club, it probably goes through a lot of their kind of like social networks to recruit people. And then in terms of coordination between the state, county, and city level, I haven't seen a lot of that. But Derek and Jin, who are on, might know more about that. So if they have any info on that, they can throw it in the chat. They've been really the like engine of research behind this. Yeah.
And then there's one more question that I think I can take a stab at, but Molly, you might know better. Is equipment bought by the police foundation to donate considered part of the police budget? I think my first answer is not necessarily. Like, if it's in the police budget, it's probably marked as like a revenue, like incoming funds, and not necessarily like the taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, that's right. It's not, I think most of the time it's not even, it would be listed as like a gift received, but it wouldn't be part of like the overall big number that they're saying like our police budget is whatever, $700 million. That doesn't include the police foundation money, which yeah, I think is a really good point and speaks to a lot of ACRE's work around this question of like what's really the true cost of policing, and that there's often hidden both costs of policing, but also hidden resources going towards police, and police foundations are definitely an example of that. Yeah. Cool. So I'm gonna hand it back to Alex, who's just gonna get us super clear on why, as people fighting to defund the police, we should care about these foundations.
Thank you. Thanks, Molly. I think folks in the chat were super excited about everything you just presented. So if you need some affirmation, I'd run through the comments. And it seems like, you know, a lot of y'all are starting to understand pretty intuitively, right? Like why this is important. But again, with another chat activity, like I would encourage y'all to answer the question in the chat. Why should we care about police foundations if our goal is to defund and ultimately abolish the police? And y'all can drop that in the chat. Why should we care about police foundations if our goal is to defund and abolish the police? And a lot of folks, yep, are starting to see the role that police foundations play. I think I saw somebody call them a local version of ALEC, and that's a really, that's a really strong way to describe it. Yes, Yep, dry up their revenue source. There's no oversight and no public accountability. This exposes the role of police as protecting capital. Yep. And we can't abolish the police if they are still funded from an outside source. Yes, yes, yes to all of these things. And so, right, like the police department budget is only a piece of like the full policing pie. You know, police do get a lot of their power and legitimacy from public budgets, but to fully defund from the police, we're going to also have to cut off the money, the contracts, and their relationships that give them power and legitimacy. So I'm just going to talk through a couple like things, like reiterating some of the stuff that Molly talked about, but make sure that we're being really explicit about what we were trying to drive home. Can we go to the next slide, please? So lack of transparency, somebody mentioned that in the chat. Police foundations don't have to disclose who their donors are or what they spend their money on. A lot of the information that Little Sis has been able to find has come primarily through what foundations will voluntarily disclose. And a couple of y'all in the chat started noticing that like your local police foundation websites have nothing on them. Something that has happened within the last month or so since Little Sis put out a piece of this research is that we've started to see that foundations are starting to like scrub their websites, removing their board members, their donors, and their projects from their website because they know they're wrong. So, you know, essentially like this is what enables police departments to purchase controversial equipment and there be no opportunity for public input or pushback. Can we go to the next slide, please? And then also they funnel resources to help increase already massive police budgets. And this is what we were talking about a little bit in trying to answer that question. You know, since the recent uprisings, there's been a lot of pressures on local elected officials to make cuts to their police budget, which is right. And like we also have to acknowledge that there are some hidden costs or hidden revenue sources for policing, and you know the police foundations is one of them. And again, like if we're going to defund, we have to cut off the public funding, their private funding, their like contracts and relationships with corporations, and their contracts with like institutions like universities as well. Next slide, please. And so, you know, with the corporations and the ultra wealthy, we see that they, you know, are backing police foundations, but also extracting resources and wealth out of Black and Brown communities. This is something that we have been trying to talk about throughout these webinars, is that corporations are creating the conditions and then they are profiting off of them. Amazon and Jeff Bezos are an example of this. Amazon sits on the executive committee for the Seattle Police Foundation and is a donor of foundations around the US. And Amazon is also selling facial recognition technology to police departments, which we know disproportionately harms Black and Latinx people in the US. Next slide. And then like Molly was saying, police foundations fund false solutions like anti-bias training or community policing programs. We know that these things do not work. The only way that we're actually going to like stop police violence is if we cut contact between police and the public. But police foundations, by continuing to fund these sort of programs, perpetuate the illusion that like we can reform the police department. I think the Atlanta Police Department or the Atlanta Police Foundation is a good example. They are like providing the infrastructure and the funding channels for 12,000 cameras in the city, making Atlanta like one of the most surveilled cities in the US. More cameras doesn't prevent crime. It doesn't get at the solutions that we need to actually answer for like poverty and violence in these neighborhoods. Like we were saying earlier, right? Like mass incarceration is not going to give us more money for schools, more money for public housing, better jobs, and, you know, quality food, mental health, the things that communities are saying that we need. Next slide, please. And then also, you know, they help, police foundations will help create opportunities for corporations to shape police priorities. This is a space where, you know, like Molly was saying, they all get to talk to each other. Imagine what kind of conversations they're going to be having. It makes it more possible for like making sure a particular real estate developer or tech CEO get to talk to, like, have a relationship with the police department, get a contract when that opportunity is there. And also knowing that police are here to protect capital, they get to strengthen that bond. And just like looking at some of the companies that Molly highlighted, and thinking about just how much money they have, right? They are going to enlist law enforcement to make sure that they can keep their pockets fat. It's almost like they are paying law enforcement to like keep the status quo in place. And I think that we have to think of it like that. We cannot give corporations the benefit of the doubt at this point in history. I mean, like the news about police killings is so mainstream. You can't tell me that like Target sees these things and doesn't know what's happening, right? They're still willing to give to the police foundation. They're still willing to ignore the demands of people on the ground and instead would rather provide support to a growing police state in a given city. And so again, like by donating to these foundations, corporations are essentially paying police and propping up their power as a means of protecting corporate wealth. Next slide, please. And so when we are successful at cutting public money from police, we also have to think about like what the pushback is going to look like. I believe, and I hope folks on this call also believe, right, that we can and will and are winning defund campaigns around the US. But we also need to keep in mind that like the billionaire class, the corporate class, like they're not going to let this go easily, right? They're not just gonna let us defund the police and be like, oh, okay, well, that's it. We heard the people, that because that's just not how it works. So we have to think about like what are going to be, like, what is that pushback going to look like? Molly talked about like how the New York City Police Foundation started as like an open checkbook for the mayor to like privatize police in the midst of a budget crisis. Like we should be preparing for those kind of things now, knowing that like this is an opportunity for more donations in support of policing. To maybe they'll defund the police department, but expand on surveillance technology, which again is policing. And then also there is the chance that there could be funding and more support, and again, establishing private security. We have to make sure that when we are talking about defunding the police, that we are talking about all of the ways that policing can look and all of the ways that those different versions of policing will be supported by corporations and by the finance industry. And so, you know, we just want to like, again, reinforce this narrative that yes, like we need to defund their budgets and then also reduce public and private investment from policing as a whole. And so with that, I will pass back to Molly to get us into our scenario discussion.
Cool, thanks, Alex. That was like an awesome, succinct argument around the police foundations. So yeah, we just wanted to, for a minute before we go into the more hard research skills, which I see people are already putting tips and tricks on how to research these foundations in the chat, which is awesome. we wanted to have a little bit of like we were originally going to do it as a small group discussion, and then we decided the technology was too complicated. So we're just going to have people throw it in the chat of a scenario for people to think through how you might start pushing back against these police foundations. So here's the scenario. It's based on Philadelphia. You are part of an organization working to defund and ultimately abolish the police in Philadelphia. Your organization is pressuring the mayor and city council to cut the current police budget in half. But some members of your group also want to put pressure on the relationships between the police and local corporations. You do a little research and find out that Comcast, Wawa, and Independence Blue Cross, the medical insurance company, are some of the biggest donors to your local police foundations, that the president of the board of the police foundation is the head of the University of Pennsylvania's public safety department, and that the police foundation has a big fundraising gala at the Ritz-Carlton this October. So you start to try to put together a plan to put some pressure on the police foundation with the ultimate goal of putting them out of business. So we want you to just brainstorm some answers to these questions. The first one is, how are you going to put the police foundation out of business? The second one is, what are some possible campaign tactics? And the third one is, who might be your allies in this fight? So yeah, I'm just curious to hear, folks can throw in the chat some answers to these questions. Plan a big direct action at the gala to bring publicity to who is pulling the strings of the police. Demand that these corporations withdraw their donations and involvement from the police foundation. Totally. So like one way to approach this is to figure out how can you cut off the big donors to these police foundations, because their money is what's keeping them up and running. Allies could be boycott and divest allies, totally anti-war people. Yeah, definitely. A group in Seattle organized a march to put pressure on Starbucks to divest. So yeah, more direct action. Doing popular education. I think that's really important in the context of these police foundations because so many people don't know about them. They really fly under the radar. Oh my gosh, there's so many good things. Boycott, social media campaign, online and physical leaflets, focus on civic leaders to work at policies to eliminate private funding and public funding. Totally putting pressure on city council or the mayor to investigate these police foundations, to come up with legislation that addresses especially the like transparency issues with them, to hold public hearings, like how do we even know who's giving them money and what they're doing. Student organizing at Penn, totally. Students can be a really important ally in this since their universities are integral. Cool, this is all awesome stuff and people can keep looking in the chat. But yeah, we just wanted to kind of lift up that there's like, it's like a very rich kind of target to do a lot of fun tactics. And like with a pretty clear strategy, which is like, if you cut off the police foundation's money, they cease to exist essentially. Okay, so now we're gonna go into how to research. Oh, actually I'm gonna talk about Philly first, so we can go to the next slide. So yeah, a lot of this is what people were talking about already. There was a group of us in Philly who, right after George Floyd was murdered and it became clear that there was a national uprising happening everywhere and happening in Philly, we put out some research about our local police foundation and their corporate backers. And it got picked up by student groups, by the local Black Lives Matter chapter here. And we've gotten some good momentum so far on really pressuring the police foundation. If we go to the next slide. We came up with some demands for the foundation. I'm gonna highlight the 3 that are bolded at the bottom. There were some demands, one, to tax all of these corporations in order to invest in a Black stimulus for Philly, which is related to what Alex was saying before, that like all of these corporations that back the police foundation are both like causing the conditions by which Black and brown communities in Philly are completely starved of public resources, and then taking advantage of those conditions by over-policing and donating to policing. So that was one. We called on every board member of the foundation to resign. We called on every corporate partner to end their relationship with the foundation and stop contributing to the foundation in any way. And then we called on all of the corporations that are affiliated with the foundation to provide a full accounting of how much money they've raised for the police, and then donate that same amount to our two local bail funds, the Philly Community Bail Fund and the Philadelphia Bail Fund. So those were our demands. We can go to the next slide. And activists, students, workers, people across Philadelphia who were really energized by the uprising kind of took these demands and the research and ran with it. So we were able to connect with some amazing students at Penn, Temple, and Drexel who incorporated Divest from the Police Foundation into the demands they were organizing around. And as of now, all three of those schools made public commitments to end their relationship with the Police Foundation, which is really exciting. We put out a report with an awesome group here, Philly We Rise, called The Real Looters of Philadelphia, that talked about the corporations backing the Police Foundation and their complicity in our policing system. There was like a couple of big petitions. There was just stuff happening all over. We had some workers at the Ritz-Carlton, where some of these CEOs live, deliver a petition to them over breakfast at the Ritz-Carlton restaurant, which was like amazing. So yeah, there's been a lot of stuff happening. And we've had some wins with these universities who, I think people were talking about this in the chat, but the universities are particularly vulnerable around this stuff. And they've committed to ending their relationship. You can go to the next slide. There's also been pushback from the Police Foundation. Alex started talking about this, but pretty soon after we released our research and started having people email all of the CEOs that are on the board of the local police foundation demanding that they step down, the Philly Police Foundation took down their whole website and just put up like this long letter basically being like, we're sad about police violence too, like give us more money because we're sad about police violence. So we definitely know that they're feeling the pressure and that there's an opening to continue pressuring them around this stuff. And we can go to the next slide. So, you know, I think once you have the information about your local police foundation, then you can start the fun part of figuring out tactics, figuring out a strategy, figuring out what demands make sense in your context, what partners, et cetera, et cetera. But the first step is really figuring out, okay, do you have a local police foundation? And if you do, what are they doing? Who are their funders? Who are their board members? So I'm gonna do some research on my shared screen and show people how to go about doing that. So I'm gonna share my screen real quick. Okay, cool. Do people see Google? So really in a lot of this research, Google is going to be your best friend. And it's not like that hard or high level of research to do. You just kind of need to know some tips and tricks and like where to look. So I'm going to use the Atlanta Police Foundation as an example. And the first thing I would do for anywhere is just to Google the name of where you live and police foundation. And that's going to take you, usually the first hit will be their official webpage. So Atlanta is an example of they haven't taken down their website yet. I'm going to show people some tricks for if your city has taken down the foundation website, how to work around that. But this is generally what the websites are going to look like. They'll be like, they really like having pictures of police holding hands with little children. You know, their contact info at the bottom, contact form, all that. And the first thing that I would usually check is just who's on their board. So that's, for here, it's under this About Us tab, and then you go down to board members. And here it has it all laid out for you, both the names of everyone on the board and what their affiliation is. So you can start seeing we've got Waffle House, we've got Wells Fargo, UPS, Home Depot, Merrill Lynch. And what I would do usually is just like throw all these names in a spreadsheet that has the name and whatever corporation they're affiliated with. And that will start to give you like a clear picture of like, okay, who's really leading this organization. Another important thing that I wanted to flag that we're going to come back to is that Atlanta actually has under their About Us tab this little financial information tab, which is kind of rare, but we'll come back to that, and that can also give us a lot of information. The other thing that's really important to look at is the events that these police foundations host, because oftentimes that's where the big corporations, the big employers, the like name brand corporations you're gonna recognize are giving money, like in the context of these little fundraisers, and they have a lot. So crime, they really like puns also, but crime is toast. This is like a breakfast fundraiser, a night in blue, blue jean ball. So if we look at the blue jean ball, for example, and click there, it has a little description of what the event is, when it is. Sometimes it has where it is. It has the co-chairs. And then at the bottom, it will have a list of sponsors. So KPMG, Delta, Invesco. So again, this is kind of giving you, I would just like throw these in a list, Hilton. And then for people that are just individual names, it's definitely worth Googling, like, who is this person? Oftentimes they'll be real estate developers and lawyers. And just whenever you're looking at these event pages, I've just noticed, like, always just make sure, Uber, it sounds obvious, but just make sure to scroll to the bottom, because a lot of times they'll have the sponsors as images at the bottom. Another important thing to check out is any media that they're putting out about their activity. So they have this little media center drop down here going to media releases and reports. And just right off the bat, there's other corporations that are named. ChickfilA Foundation, the head of General Electric is headlining their Crime is Toast fundraiser. So again, lots of familiar corporate names. The Atlanta website in general, I would say, is like gives more information than a lot of police foundation websites and is kind of easier to navigate. If you're going to the website, they still have the website up, but you're not finding a lot. One kind of trick is to do a site search, which is basically tell Google, I only want to search within their website. And the way you do that is you do in your search bar, site : so you're saying, Google, I only want you to search atlantapolicefoundation.org. And then I would basically just search it for a few keywords like sponsor, corporate, donor. Even like if you know, oh, if I'm in Atlanta, it's probably likely that CocaCola is related to the police foundation somehow. You can do site atlantapolicefoundation.org and then in quotes, CocaCola. And then it brings you up everywhere that the term Coca-Cola is on their website. And then that can take you to pages where you find other information like the board, like that they were the co-chairs of the Crime is Toast benefit in 2017. And then you see these pictures of all these other corporate sponsors. So that can also be really useful. Like if you're a student at Emory and you want to be like, okay, does Emory have any connections to the police foundation? Do a site search for Emory, see if they come up. And then also doing words like sponsors, donors can be helpful. So like, for example, if I do that here, sponsor, the first thing that comes up is like this form they use to recruit sponsors that tells you how much money you have to give to be each level of sponsor. So then you could go back to those event pages and be like, oh, well, UPS was a deputy chief sponsor. That means they gave it $15K that year. So it can also help you get a little more specific about numbers, since they don't have to be super transparent and don't have to report that all in one place. For those of you who are asking how to, if you go to your police foundation's website and they don't have the board listed, the thing that's going to be really helpful for that is a form called the 990. And that's basically a form that every nonprofit has to file with the IRS. Atlanta actually has it on their website. Not all of them will, and I'll show you how to find it if they don't. But if we go to financial information, it says here 2018 990. And it's more of like a kind of boring looking, a little bit annoying to read document like this, but it will give you some of the key information you need to figure out who's backing your local police foundation. So there's a lot of boilerplate language and it's pretty long, but I'm just gonna give you guys kind of things to look for. On the first page, it's gonna tell you the name of the organization, their address, their contact info, basic stuff like that. There is also always a page that tells you the board and the leadership of the organization, and they have to by law do that. So it's going to be called this Part 7, compensation of officers, directors, trustees, key employees, highest compensated employees, and independent contractors. So this is where they list out the director's name. So again, if you have a local police foundation that doesn't have the board of directors listed, they have to file a 990 and they have to include their leadership. It's a little more annoying because now you'd have to Google every person's name to figure out what corporations they were affiliated with, but it's not too much work. The other nice thing is also it tells you who their highest paid employee is. So in Atlanta, for example, their CEO makes almost $300,000 a year. So that can be a nice little talking point. The other important areas on this that I wanted to flag for people is a section called grants and other assistance to organizations. So to find that, I'm just going to use the search grants and other assistance. And it's going to take me to this Schedule 1, Part 1. And this will tell you how much money in this year they granted to your local police department. So in Atlanta, for example, it was 3.3 million this year. So again, some police foundations will report this number publicly and it'll be in news clippings and stuff, but if it's not, you can always find it there. And then they also have to list more information about what types of programs they helped fund, and that's usually going to be all the way at the end. Here, supplemental information, and it names different programs that they helped fund. So something called Operation Shield, which is like a surveillance thing, At Promise, which is like a youth policing program, and yeah, so you secure neighborhoods. So you can kind of go through here and like decode the language and read more about if you want to get clear on like, okay, what exactly is my police foundation funding? So yeah, so that's some really great information. The other thing that I would really recommend for people is, especially if you're looking on your police foundation's website, is just take screenshots of everything. That's what we did in Philly so that we could have a record of the website even after they took it down, which was really useful in talking with reporters and just like kind of saving information for ourselves. I'll also show something called the Wayback Machine, which other people were talking about in the chat in a minute. Other basic things, I would definitely do like a Google News search of the name of your police foundation. So, you know, just Google Atlanta Police Foundation, go to the news tab. There's some stuff now that's about the reporting that we've been doing as Little Sis, but also like local media, an article in the Atlanta Business Chronicle, for example, that's an interview with the head of the police foundation. That will also give you a good sense of who's publicly talking about the police foundation, what their priorities are, and kind of like what their most recent priorities have been. The other thing that has been really useful for us is just reading through social media of different police foundations. So again, use Google the police foundation in Facebook, Google the police foundation in Twitter, and find where their accounts are. And similarly to doing that site search like we did on the Atlanta Police Foundation's website for specific terms, you can use Twitter Advanced Search. Again, just Google Twitter Advanced Search. This is very helpful and we use it all the time at Little Sis. You can basically tell Twitter I only want you to search from particular accounts. So I'm saying ATL Police Foundation, which is the Atlanta Police Foundation's account. And then you can put words, bring up anything. So sponsor, for example. And this will bring up, here's all the times that the Atlanta Police Foundation has tweeted the word sponsor. And yeah, so it gives, thank you Wells Fargo, thank you Invesco, thank you Acuity Brands, thank you Coca-Cola, thank you UPS. So again, you get a really clear sense of like, okay, here's the corporations. And again, if Atlanta didn't have as much of a kind of public out there website that listed all of this, this would be another kind of creative way to find it. And yeah, do all those same search terms, like I was saying, partner, sponsor, even like thank you, like the phrase thank you, because they'll often be saying that to their sponsors. The other thing I wanted to show people was if you search for your police foundation website and you find out that they don't have one, or it looks like it's been taken down, or they just put up a message that's like, you know, we're sad about police violence too, you can use something called the Wayback Machine. So if you go to archive.org, and basically what the Wayback Machine does is it saves versions of websites on particular dates, so that even if the Philly Police Foundation website is down now, they'll have a previous version of it. So for example, when I go to the Philly Police Foundation website, this is what it looks like. It's just like this one-page statement. But if I type in their URL here on the Wayback Machine and click Browse History, it's definitely a little slower, so this might take a minute, but it's going to take you to previous versions. So you'll see a little calendar like this. I'm going to go back to 2019, December 23rd. So the ones that have the little colored squares are when the Wayback Machine saved versions of it. And then it's going to load what the website looked like at that point. And it takes a couple of minutes because it's kind of slow. Loading. Alex, are there any questions from the chat while we're waiting for this to load to prove to people?
Oh, there are questions. Let me see. There was one question asking, do police foundations typically only give to one specific city or local police department? And have you come across any that give to more than one? I guess, like, are there any rules or parameters around where a local police foundation can give?
Most of the ones that I've seen, it's a pretty one-to-one thing where it's like the Los Angeles City Police Department has a foundation that is its partner foundation, basically, or Philadelphia. But like I did see, for example, like there are towns, like suburbs of Philly that, you know, colloquially we would say like are part of Philly, and they had their own police foundations that typically were smaller because it was like a smaller town. But yeah, most of what I've seen, and people should correct me, especially folks from Little Sis in the chat, but it's pretty one-to-one.
Can I ask one more question before we get back into this? Yeah. Somebody asked if sheriffs have like a county police foundation.
You know, sometimes I have seen that sheriffs are on the board of these police foundations, but I don't think I've come across anything that's like a specific foundation for the sheriff's office, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It's totally possible. Cool. So yeah, so people can see on the Wayback Machine, this is what the Philly Police Foundation's website used to look like. It had almost $100.5 million. Here's everything we bought. Here's how to join us. Here's our partners. So they took all of this down since they were facing public pressure. But the Wayback Machine is really helpful to kind of go back, and they can't really cover their tracks there. I'm going to show people 2 more really good resources for doing this research. One goes back to those 990s that we were talking about, the form with the IRS. So sometimes the foundation will have it on their website, but they don't always. So there's a really great tool from ProPublica Nonprofit Explorer, that will allow you to search and find your local police foundation's 990. So Atlanta Police Foundation, name of the nonprofit, the first thing here, and then you go down to 2018. Usually it'll be behind by a couple of years what's available, so 2018 is the most recent one. And it takes you to the exact same thing that we saw on their website. So again, if your police foundation doesn't have a website with a lot of information, this is basically going straight to the original source. So that's really helpful. The last tool that I wanted to talk about is littlesis.org, which is the database that my organization, Little Sis, I need to figure out how to delete my history because you guys can see that I was Googling about Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. Which everyone knows is my obsession. Okay, so littlesis.org is a free database. Anyone can join. We kind of call it a Facebook, an involuntary Facebook of the 1%, which is, super rich corporations, individuals, billionaires all have a profile page in here that users have created. And because we've been doing a fair amount of research about police foundations, there's some good stuff in here. So we have a training coming up on how to use all the ins and outs of littlesis.org that I'll put up on a slide. But really quickly, to give you an example, you can search for example, the New York Police Foundation up here in the search bar. And a whole bunch of stuff will come up, including this entities, New York City Police Foundation. And this is basically a profile page with a ton of information that different users have added about the police foundation. So you can see leadership and staff, you can see funders, donors, and any of these relationships. If you click the little relationship here, it'll also take you to the source link of where they got the information from. So again, if you're not finding stuff, Little Sis can be a good place to start. One thing I wanted to highlight too is that there's this interlocks tab. And basically this shows you, if you're looking at New York City Police Foundation, it shows you here are all the other organizations that the New York City Police Foundation has people in common with. They're interlocks. So it can be really interesting to look at. And if you're thinking about a campaign, thinking about secondary targets, thinking about potential allies, this shows you like, okay, all of these people, like 5 people, have positions, probably board positions, but maybe other leadership positions at both the Police Foundation and the Real Estate Board of New York. What does that tell us? All of these people have positions at both the Police Foundation and Columbia University. Maybe we should reach out to some Columbia students. The Whitney Museum of Art, maybe we should reach out to some artist activists we know. So this can be really kind of interesting in kind of building out the networks, again, that are backing and maintaining policing. The other thing I wanted to highlight is we do have those Little Sis interactive maps that I showed on some of the slides. So again, if you just search Police Foundation and go down here to network maps, these are a whole bunch of maps that include information about police foundations that different Little Sis users have made. So for example, which one should we look at? New York City Police Foundation. Let's look at this one. So this is a great one that one of our researchers, Rob, made that goes into the power behind the New York City Police Foundation. Here's a bunch of relationships they have. And then if you click this next button, it gives you more information and zooms in on particular industries. So there's a bunch of stuff that Rob found about the real estate industry, law firms, finance, major corporations. So yeah, again, I would just encourage people, you can go to littlesis.org/join to make an account. And it's just a good place to start if you don't know where else to start. Yeah, I think that's the main research tools I wanted to show people. Are there any other questions folks have? We'll definitely send around the recording because I know that went through a lot all at once.
Thanks, Molly. So I grabbed a couple of questions from the chat and from the Q&A. Been trying to keep up and answer them as they come. So we just have 3 questions here for right now. Do foundations typically donate to the Fraternal Order of Police chapters, so the union?
So I don't think they donate money directly, but they definitely have a very close relationship that would probably warrant some more scrutiny. And like the reality is, like, we don't know exactly what the nature of the relationship is because these police foundations are so opaque. That would be a great question to ask in a public hearing about these police foundations. In almost every, if not every, police foundation I've looked at, the head of the police union is on the board of the police foundation. So that definitely tells you there's a strong relationship. Yeah, but I think it definitely warrants some more investigating.
Great. And then somebody asked, are there legal or other mechanisms preventing private corporations from directly funding police departments through gifts, even if there are no foundations?
That's a good question. And so there's nothing that I know about. I think that's something that's come up as we're going to poll folks in a second to see if people are interested in joining campaigns and starting campaigns to pressure these foundations, but we definitely are interested in looking at a fix like that. Like, is there some kind of legislative or legal intervention around this money? But there's nothing that I know of that exists.
And then one more question from Margot, who has been looking during our webinar at Portland. And Margot said that they can't find any official police foundations for Portland agencies, but it seems that Portland State University does all of the things that you say a police foundation would. If Oregon's universities function like a shadow network of police agencies or foundations, would they, I think this is like, would they be required to give information since they're technically public? So I think maybe like, would we be able to FOIA or find some sort of public information for a university?
It should be it should be much easier to find information for any kind of public entity. Like Alex was saying, with a Freedom of Information Act request, with just having students at the university request information, sometimes they'll be a lot more forthcoming with that. So yeah, it might be a little bit of a different research path, and we'll put our contact info up and we're happy to follow up with people around specifics of that, but you should be able to get something.
And then last question, has anyone looked at how this might be for us as panelists, but also folks on the call, has anyone looked at how leadership of boards has changed over time in terms of the individuals or companies, or even the membership? Like, is there more real estate versus banks, and do those things typically shift?
That's a really good question. I haven't personally looked over time. Sarah, I was looking at Sarah in here, but Jen and Derek and Rob, who are on, if you guys have looked at all, feel free to put anything in there, but I think it would be an interesting question. I know that my hunch on that would be similar to what ACRE has talked about in some of these webinars. Because of financialization, my wild hunch would be that Wall Street has played an increasingly large role in these police foundations because and tech, because both of those industries have played increasingly large roles in almost all of our institutions, but I haven't looked specifically.
Yeah, I know I was looking at the Atlanta board yesterday, and it's like, there's so much real estate. And it just, you know, these things, the questions answer themselves when we want to figure out why. And I think a couple more questions have come through. Do fire departments have similar front organizations? And can you find documents from police departments themselves that show how much they are receiving from foundations and nonprofits?
So I haven't come across similar organizations. I mean, I think there are kind of like Friends of Firemen organizations that might function kind of similarly, but I'm not sure. And I also haven't looked as much on the budget documents for the police department side. I think that ACRE probably knows more about that than I do from that kind of total cost of policing thing about how to get into the public budgets. The main way that I've gotten at that information is by looking at the 990s, where the foundations have to disclose how much money they've granted to the police departments.
Okay, well, that catches us up on all of our questions.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. So Derek, can you put the slides back up and share your screen? And then we're going to finish out with our poll. Cool. We can go to the next slide. Okay, cool. So, you know, one of the reasons why we organized this webinar is because, like I was mentioning, we kind of put out a bunch of information about these police foundations right in the wake of the uprising, and it seemed like there was some momentum and interest on really kind of running with the organization and doing some campaigning on the corporations that prop up these police foundations. And we're kind of figuring all of that out and what that might look like. But we're definitely really interested in hearing from you all if you are interested in starting a campaign like that, or if you're already working on a campaign that's targeting one of these corporations in a different way, that maybe some element around their backing of policing could be incorporated. So Derek is going to launch a poll right now that will let people say yes or no to both of these questions. It should pop up on your screen right now. And if you answer there, we'll be able to follow up with you. You know, it's not committing to anything. It's basically just letting us know if you say yes, you're interested in any of these things, you'll get a follow-up from one of us to try to figure out how we can kind of take all the little, you know, important work that's happening around police foundations and try to build it up into something that's bigger. So we'll let people take a few minutes or maybe a minute to answer that. And if you're on your phone or if you don't see the poll somehow, you can also just put in the chat. We'll save the chat if the poll isn't working for you.
Molly, I know somebody had mentioned being interested in connecting people that are in their area that are also interested in this stuff. So, you know, I don't know if when the correspondence goes out, if there's a way to sort of like organize it based on where people are, and maybe we can sort of facilitate small group conversations in some way. I mean, I also suggested in the chat, like if you are looking to connect with people that are on this webinar and in your area, I would just drop in the chat where you are and have folks private message you.
Totally. Yeah, people should do that now, and we'll give folks a couple minutes to do that. We did ask people where city you live in, so as much as we can based on the signups that we have, we'll try to connect folks as well. Cool. And I don't know, Derek, I think you should be able to see how many people have done the poll. So just whenever Derek, you think we've got enough, you can close the poll out. Cool. Okay, awesome. We can go to the last thing. So real quick, just some additional resources. And again, we'll share all this out, but news.littlesis.org is our blog where our amazing research team has been writing about this issue a lot. littlesis.org/join is how you join Little Sis. And we have a Little Sis training with our wonderful community manager, Manira, on August 4th that will show you all the ins and outs of how to use our database. And we'll definitely send a follow-up email. We'll try to connect people and connect with people as much as we can. And be on the lookout for the next webinar in this COPS and Capitalism series from the amazing people at ACRE. And I think we're done.
That's it. Yeah, I will just add that the next webinar in this series is on August 12th. You can follow ACRE campaigns on Twitter, or my email address is here, but also like sign up for ACRE's email list, because that's where we're sending information out. That and our Twitter is where we're sending info out about registering for the webinars. And I'll drop that stuff in the chat. But look at us, we have 5 minutes left. We ended 5 minutes early.
Cool.
Cool. Well, with that, thanks y'all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Cool. Thanks everyone. Thanks Alex. Thank you, Derek.